Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Laboratories of Terror, the final act of Stalin's Great Purge in Soviet Ukraine. Edited by Lynne Viola and Mark Stefan Junge. Narrated by Christina Delaine. Introduction. Lynne Viola and Mark Junge. Laboratories of Terror explores the final chapter of Stalin's Great Terror. On November 1938, the Communist Party Central Committee and the Council of People's Commissars of the USSR issued a directive halting mass operations and repression and liquidating the infamous troikas that had served as the main extrajudicial bodies in charge of the fate of hundreds of thousands of Soviet citizens. This directive served not only to end the mass operations, but also led to the release of large numbers of mainly communist purge victims whose cases remained incomplete. At the same time, it resulted in the Purge of the Purgers, or the Beria Thaw, named after the newly appointed head of the NKVD, L.P. Beria, who oversaw this operation. This episode in the history of the Soviet Union remained hidden from view for decades in the largely closed archives of the Soviet Security Police. The opening of the Ukrainian Security Police Archives, HDA-SBU, in the 2010s, allowed historians for the first time to begin to excavate this chapter in the Great Terror. Laboratories of Terror illuminates the world of the NKVD perpetrator and the mechanisms and logistics of the terror at the local level, two subjects previously opaque. NKVD perpetrators are at the center of this story. The documentary materials on the Purge of the Purgers derive largely from their criminal files. The criminal files contain verbatim records of the closed trials of NKVD operatives at Republican, Oblast, District, Rayon, and city levels, along with original arrest warrants, documentation on searches, biographical information offered up in standard forms, as well as autobiographical statements from the accused, interrogation transcripts of the accused and of witnesses, petitions for mercy, sentencing and appeal documentation, and a variety of other types of materials. NKVD operatives' personnel files, Lichny Dila, and the stenographic reports of NKVD Communist Party meetings from late 1938 and early 1939 provide additional materials and contextualization for understanding this final phase of the Great Terror. The Great Terror, 1937 to 1938, in the Soviet Union, has long occupied a central role in the history of Stalinism. During a 16-month period, the Stalin regime arrested and convicted over 1.5 million of its own citizens, largely on trumped-up charges of counter-revolutionary, anti-Soviet, or socially harmful activity. Half of those convicted were summarily executed. The rest ended up in the Gulag, where they became victims of forced labor, daily abuse, and premature death. The majority of victims of the Great Terror were ordinary people, caught up in two large mass operations launched in these years, one against former kulaks, recidivist criminals, and other anti-Soviet and socially dangerous elements, and the other against a series of non-Russian ethnicities. The mass operations came largely in the wake of the elite, or nomenklatura, purges, spreading the terror far and wide through the vast territories of the Soviet Union. Mass Operation 00447, dated July 30, 1937, was entitled the Operation to Repress Former Kulaks, Criminals, and Anti-Soviet Elements. Although this operation has come to be known in the literature as the Kulak Operation, this is a misnomer. The Kulak, or former Kulak, figured prominently in this operation, but was not the sole socio-political category subsumed. Nor should the figure of the Kulak be confused with an objective socio-economic category. The kulak was mostly a political construct, defined oxymoronically as a capitalist peasant during collectivization and, later, By earlier repression in exile or in the labor camps, so-called biological factors, such as a parent or grandparent who was a kulak or other socio-economic enemy, and largely subjective political criteria including participation in anti-collectivization protests. In addition to the kulak, Mass Operation 00447 included as targets of repression former members of anti-Soviet political parties, a series of old regime elites falling under the category of bivshie lyudi, or former people, such as Tsarist officials, gendarmes, village elders and clergy, fugitives from repression, and a range of recidivist petty criminals. These already elastic categories would expand according to regional specificities that led to additional enemy categories. Mass Operation 00447 also included the most hostile and active participants of Cossack White Guard insurrectionary organizations, fascist, terrorist, and espionage diversionary formations. Following a month of preparations, including canvassing of lower-level NKVD organs on the numbers of anti-Soviet elements in their domains, and a July 16, 1937 meeting of regional NKVD representatives in Moscow, the all-union NKVD compiled a set of control figures for the number of people to be arrested in the course of Mass Operation 00447. The total numbers of planned arrests was 268,950, divided between a first, most dangerous category, 75,950, and a second, less dangerous category, 193,000. First category subjects were to be executed by shooting. Second category subjects were to be confined in the Gulag for periods of 8 to 10 years. With some exceptions, the operation was set to begin on August 5, 1937, starting with the arrest of first-category subjects, and to end in 4 months. NKVD investigations of arrested suspects were to occur quickly and in simplified order, with an eye to establishing the criminal connections of those arrested. Upon completion of the investigation, the accused were sent on to an extrajudicial troika, generally consisting of the leaders of the relevant regional NKVD, Communist Party Committee, and Procurator's Office. The Troika passed judgment on the accused, sentencing them either to time in the Gulag or death. An NKVD memo of August 8, 1937, ordered the Troikas not to announce death sentences to those assigned to the first category, most likely as a precaution against unrest at the time of execution. The Troikas generally worked at night. They also worked at great speed. One Troika in Leningrad condemned 658 Solovetsky Island prisoners in one night. Another in Omsk reviewed 50 to 60 cases per hour. The number of arrests quickly surged beyond the NKVD's initial control figures, reaching as many as 555,641 by the end of December 1937. Although the original NKVD order strictly forbade any lower NKVD organ from independently increasing its arrest numbers, it did allow these organs, as well as regional party committees, to petition for larger numbers, and Stalin and the Politburo seldom refused. The deadline for the completion of Mass Operation 00447, moreover, was repeatedly extended, first to December 10, 1937, then to January 1, 1938, and finally to March 15, 1938. After that last date, with the exception of Ukraine, the capital cities, and certain key penal regions such as Siberia, the Kulak operation gave way to the so-called national operations. After the confirmation of the Kulak operation, at the end of July 1937, the NKVD produced a series of operational orders against specific ethnicities: Poles, Germans, Finns, Latvians, Estonians, Greeks, Romanians, Chinese, and others. On paper, none of these orders called for targeting an entire ethnicity, but for the arrests of national elements supposedly engaged in espionage. In fact, at its worst, The national operation swept up thousands based only on ethnic indicators. To take the Polish operation, 00485, for example, candidates for arrest included all those who could be said to belong, or to have belonged, to the Polish military organization, POV. This was a largely non-existent organization within the Soviet Union at this time that was said to have infiltrated the Polish Communist Party, the Red Army, the NKVD, and other institutions. Also targeted were Polish POWs from the 1920 Soviet-Polish War, Polish political émigrés, former members of a series of Polish political parties, and the most active local anti-Soviet and nationalist elements from territories with Polish populations. However, anyone with a Polish or Polish-sounding name could be arrested. The Poles suffered the heaviest losses, 105,485, followed by the Germans, 75,331. As a rule, most ethnicities targeted represented diaspora nations, which, in Stalin's eyes, raised the risk of dual loyalties, particularly in the vulnerable border zones where these populations often lived. The primary administrative difference between the Kulak and national operations was that, instead of the Troika, a dvoika, or two-man team consisting of the heads of the relevant regional NKVD and procuracy organs, sat in judgment, condemning individuals and groups to either the first or the second category of punishment. After judgment, the dvoika's lists were sent to Moscow for confirmation by the so-called Great Dvoika, composed of Nikolai Yezhov, NKVD Commissar for the USSR, and A. Vyshinsky, State Procurator of the USSR. From September 17, 1938, the Dvoika was replaced by the National or Special Troika, formed on the basis of NKVD Order 00606. Another singularity of the national operations, especially the Polish operation, was that they were far deadlier than 00447, with an imprisonment to execution ratio of 1 to 3, versus that of 1 to 4 for 00447. Initially, the national operations were to be completed within 3 months. The deadline was subsequently and repeatedly postponed, with a final date set for August 1, 1938 in most regions. In practice, the Kulak and national operations overlapped temporarily and could share similar targets. In Ukraine, in 1938, the implementation of the two operations often lacked clear demarcations, with categories of enemies shifted between different NKVD departments. The number of arrests for both operations skyrocketed far beyond the original control figures. In the Soviet Union as a whole, by July 1, 1938, roughly 1,420,711 people had been arrested. Of these, 699,929 were apprehended in the course of the Kulak operation, including 376,207 former Kulaks, 121,963 recidivist criminals, and 201,860 miscellaneous counter-revolutionary elements. The totals for both operations listed some 522,774 former kulaks, 191,384 bivshi lyudi, 168,286 elements without a defined occupation, 45,009 clergy, and 229,957 white-collar employees. Out of these, a mere 99,188 were Communist Party members, and 15,088 were members of the Komsomol. From the 681,692 executions of the Great Terror, some 90% were caught up in these mass operations. In Ukraine, at a minimum, 267,579 people were arrested, and 122,237 of them executed in 1937 and 1938. Stalin publicly proclaimed the Great Terror to be a success. At the 18th Party Congress in March 1939, he claimed that the nation's purge had resulted in the final liquidation of the exploiting classes, okончательная ликвидация остатков эксплуататорских классов. He forcefully contested what he called the foreign press's contention that the purge had weakened the Soviet state, labeling that kind of talk banal gossip, poshная болтовня. Instead, he claimed that the purge had created a new единородность, or internal unity, of the Soviet people that made the Red Army stronger than any other nation's army. This is an important point, because at no time in the 1930s or later did Stalin renounce what has come to be known as the Great Terror. Instead, Stalin renounced those Soviet officials, mainly in the NKVD, who had violated socialist or revolutionary legality in the conduct of mass operations. His renunciation led to the destruction of important clientele or patronage networks within the NKVD. In Ukraine, NKVD boss A.I. Uspiensky's fall cleared the way for the arrest of his subordinates, just as NKVD Commissar Yezhov's downfall prompted Uspiensky's flight, as well as the destruction of Yezhov's clientele network throughout the Soviet Union. Although the NKVD had been subject to purges earlier in 1937 and 1938, as new NKVD leaders brought in their tails and destroyed pre-existing clientele networks, this particular purge was different. It did not feature accusations of Trotskyism or counter-revolution, as in earlier NKVD purges, but served instead to scapegoat the NKVD, or publicly, elements within the NKVD, for violations of socialist legality in the Great Terror. The NKVD purge also resulted in what some historians call a cadre revolution in the NKVD, following the arrests of NKVD personnel who were, in turn, replaced with a new clientele network, Berias, that would more or less remain in office until Stalin's death in 1953. This purge of the purgers resulted in a series of trials of NKVD operatives under the jurisdiction of military tribunals that occurred throughout the country. These trials proceeded under the aegis of Soviet justice, an often oxymoronic designation in those times. Yet they had little in common with the staged show trials of the 1930s, and nothing whatsoever in common with the assembly line troika processing of the victims of the mass operations. Instead, these trials more closely resembled the wartime and post-war trials of World War II collaborators and war criminals within the Soviet Union. Scholars who have studied these later trials have concluded that, despite their political and ideological imprimatur, they were, as Alexander Prusin writes, held in full accordance with juridical norms and provided relatively accurate descriptions of the war in the Soviet Union. According to Tanya Pinter, the wartime and post-war trials served the Stalinist regime for its own legitimation inside Soviet society and abroad, with pedagogical and symbolic meaning. The trials of NKVD cadres at the end of the 1930s also revealed a wealth of valuable information about the Great Terror, as well as serving pedagogical and disciplinary purposes, in spite of the fact that there was scant mention of them in the press. The NKVD trials were meant to have a disciplinary impact on the NKVD. The relatively wide participation of NKVD operatives in these trials made it highly likely that the substance of the trials was known among its cadres. Their participation as witnesses and signalers meant that they knew what was occurring at these trials locally. Certainly, they discussed these events with other NKVD colleagues at the late 1938, early 1939 NKVD Communist Party meetings, and likely elsewhere outside of the trials, given the frequent violations of their secrecy agreements. The trials made it clear, above all, that the NKVD, whether due to institutional interests, clans, that is, clientele networks, or a few bad apples, must be brought under the control of Stalin and the Communist Party. Above all, they were intended to demonstrate that Stalin was not to blame. The trials also sent a message to the Communist Party. Stalin cast the party as the main victim of the Great Terror. Party members and other elites played a prominent role in the trials, mainly as victims, sometimes as victimized witnesses. The party was given a key role to play in correcting the violations and seeking out the transgressors in the NKVD. The Communist Party would also hereafter serve, along with its youth wing, the Komsomol, as the main recruitment pool for the new NKVD cadres brought in to replace their disgraced predecessors. The trials were part of an emerging narrative of communist victimization in the terror, followed by the restoration of party control, a narrative traditionally associated with Khrushchev and his 20th Party Congress secret speech in 1956. The narrative pitted the NKVD against the Communist Party, airbrushing away the majority of the Great Terror's victims, who were neither communist nor elite, and importantly, ignoring the central role of the leadership of the party in the Great Terror. The trials were Stalin's symbolic gift to the party, serving to re-legitimize its authority and its power following 2 years of its supposedly diminished status. Stalin was well aware of the devastating impact of the Great Terror. He certainly knew about its legion of victims, as well as the extent to which the terror was undermining local, especially communist, authority. The victims were not silent, either during or after the mass operations. They and their relatives inundated higher authorities with literally hundreds of thousands of letters of complaint. On February 22, 1938, USSR Procurator Vyshinsky complained to Molotov that the USSR Procurator's office was unable to handle the volume of written complaints, noting that in the first 20 days of February alone, it had received 40,000 of them. In 1938, as a whole, the Procurator's office received some 600,000 complaints related to the terror. The Russian Republic Procurator's office was also overwhelmed, receiving 700 to 800 complaints daily, and from February 1938, 50,000 to 60,000 monthly. The Ukrainian Republic Procurator's office received some 170,855 complaints between January 1, 1939 and January 1, 1940. Of which 46,695 went to the Republican offices of the Procurator and 124,160 to their oblast offices in 16 Ukrainian oblasts. The Kyiv Oblast Procurator received 21,278 in the same period. These complaints represented the proverbial tip of the iceberg, as victims and their relatives also besieged the offices of Stalin, Yezhov, and a large range of other individuals and institutions at all geographical administrative levels. Needless to say, not all these complaints came from communists. Stalin, therefore, was fully aware of the pushback against the mass operations. The November 17, 1938 directive opened up a second floodgate of complaints. News of the directive very quickly reached the prison cells of the NKVD. Many prisoners, whose cases had not yet been completed, rescinded their confessions at this time. This phenomenon was fairly widespread, according to NKVD complaints, and continued into 1939. As a result of the November directive, unfinished cases were transferred to the courts, and possibly as many as 110,000 people, mainly communists, were freed. In addition, some 77,000 purged communists were reinstated into the party. At the least, these transfers of cases and releases relieved the deadly prison overcrowding of 1938 and the huge backlog of unfinished cases. At most, they may have served to cover up old wounds and to further strengthen the narrative of victimized communists. Stalin may also have been troubled by reports that news of the mass operations had breached the information security perimeters of the NKVD. Although at this point the evidence is far from conclusive, it is clear that there was considerable leakage of the terror into the public domain. the trials demonstrated the ways in which the sheer noise of terror reached the streets from the NKVD prisons. Another type of leakage came with the appearance of executed victims' clothing at local markets, as the wives of NKVD execution squad members tried to benefit from their self-proclaimed hard and dirty work. NKVD operatives also lived at least for a time in the same general areas as their victims, often leading lonely bachelor lives and residing in shoddy Soviet hotels due to local housing shortages and frequent transfers. In the town of Uman in Kiev Oblast, for example, the hotel became a center for NKVD carousing and drunkenness. Here there were also reports of NKVD interrogators sleeping with prisoners' wives in exchange for the privilege of access to a loved one. In Moscow, according to Russian historian A.U. Vatyin, the solution to the housing shortage was for NKVD operatives to move into the victims' former dwellings. Outside of Moscow, this may have been a less attractive prospect, given the dismal state of the housing stock. Occasional reports of demonstrations by prisoners' wives also surface in the Ukrainian documents, providing further possible evidence of leakage and suggesting that some brave souls may have attempted to protest more publicly. The precise dimensions of public knowledge about the terror cannot be demarcated. Still, it is clear that there was leakage, and Stalin must have known and been worried about news of the terror leaking out. News of the mass operations had also leaked out abroad, and in the Republican NKVD offices in Kiev, there was near panic when the Munich Agreement was reached in the fall of 1938. That agreement raised grave doubts in Stalin's mind about the willingness of the West to fight Hitler. Hedging his bets, Stalin may have realized that war was approaching, and it was time to end the mass repressions. The irony here is that Stalin's war against a supposed fifth column likely strengthened rather than weakened his sense of international danger. In any case, it is likely that Stalin utilized these trials to address the grievances of selected audiences, mainly but not only elite audiences, while transferring the blame for their grievances away from himself and on to designated groups and individuals within the NKVD. Perhaps he recognized that, in pursuit of the destruction of the much-touted fifth column, the terror had begun to create seedlings for new columns. Perhaps he only cared about the damage done to the party's credibility. Initially, Stalin had asked Vyshinsky, the Soviet chief procurator, to organize an open trial of leading NKVD workers before evidently reconsidering. The open and extremely revelatory reactions of provincial and local NKVD workers at their trials may have influenced him in this reconsideration. Ultimately, though, Yezhov, Uspiensky, and the past leadership of the NKVD would be condemned for treason, on the grounds of attempting to undermine the Soviet government and crush the Communist Party, while middle and lower-level personnel were condemned for their violations of socialist legality. Stalin's scapegoating of officials of various stripes for violations in policy implementation removed the blame from him. It permitted him to explain away violations and excesses in policy implementation as the work of a relatively few bad apples. A face-saving measure for both Stalin and his policies, it was not unlike similar practices used by other governments to avoid blame. It was also an established practice that Stalin used to distance himself from the worst of policy practices once a radical breakthrough was achieved. He first deployed it in the violent 1930 collectivization campaign, publishing his famous article, Dizziness with Success, that led to the scapegoating of, largely, lower-level Communist Party and Soviet government officials for excesses in policy implementation. Stalin was clearly not interested in justice per se. His goal to purge Soviet society of its supposed fifth column, if not exactly fulfilled, had gone as far as it could, and a policy of scapegoating served to paper over social grievances. In 1939, the Purge of the Purgers, or the Beria Purge, resulted in the turnover of some 7,372 NKVD operatives at all levels of its bureaucracy. The NKVD purge effectively led to the removal of 22.9% of its operational staff.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?